she's very famous, like
Oh, yeah.
gets stuff with L'Oreal and all that. She's a British, and she took her hijab off over a period of time. She was doing the thing that a lot of Muslim girls will do. It became a turban, and then it did this, and then it was a hat, and initially was talking about skin conditions, and then she just said, I don't want to wear this, I'm happy for you to wear it. And you can imagine that created so much tension around like what she was doing. But because people like her starting to do that, and they're getting a bit of confidence in doing it, it's giving a lot of confidence to many other people. And I remember like ex-Muslims sometimes don't like people like that, like the kind of Muslima makeup, or like, who are kind of, they defend Islam a lot, but they do it in their own way. And I love that stuff, because I'm like, that's how you're creating heterogeneity of thought. But that, for example, I'll start off with giving a sense of scale. So there are, I think, 1.9 billion people who fall under being Muslim. The problem with population census is you kind of force them to be born in a Muslim country before Muslim. And if you take any of the various studies that look at how many people might leave Islam or are atheist or don't practice, the number tends to fall between about 2 to as much as 5 or 6%. So let's half that and make it 3% as an average. You're talking about 60 million ex-Muslims, basically. That's kind of a very rough estimate as to how many you could assume are there. That's 3 out of 100 Muslims maybe don't believe. And I think that's a fair assessment. The problem is there's no way to really study this properly. You can go into certain countries, you can make calls like in some of the Pew Research polls are basically calling up people from, while you're living in Pakistan, calling you up and saying, how religious are you out of 10, or that kind of question. So of course you're going to get bias on that. But the countries where you have the most religious freedom, including in the States, the ex-Muslim percentages are way higher, right? And then, interestingly, Saudi Arabia had a 5% atheist number, which is quite interesting. So scale-wise, if we're talking about 60 million people potentially who've left Islam, it's a pretty big number. And I'll tell you a little bit about my story, and then I want to speak much more about kind of ex-Muslims and different movements and what we've seen change and where things are now, and also just a bit wider on apostasy. I don't like to talk about ex-Muslims by themselves without talking about the concept of leaving in general and the difficulties there. Just going to make sure I could yeah. Now I'm not going to talk a lot. I'm going to talk for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then I think Son will go through some questions, and I really like to make things interactive, so we'll talk together. So I grew up as one of those back then I think it was probably 1.6 billion Muslims. I'm British, but I was born in the UK, but I spent 10 years in the liberal bastion of the world, Saudi Arabia. You might have heard of it. In Riyadh. I went to you couldn't say you went to an Islamic or non-Islamic school because everything had Islam in it. When you went to an American school, you studied Islam. You went to a Saudi school, you studied Islam. And that was my growing up. And then I moved back to the UK, to East London. And I always say it's quite interesting that people assume my upbringing in Saudi Arabia was super religious. It's the other way around. East London was crazy religious, like really, really religious. In Saudi Arabia, where sometimes women would wear like full face covering and niqab, in East London and in London in general, there was a move towards doing that, like often by choice. Like people wanted that. There was this kind of push that that's your identity. So yeah, I think it's quite important to say that it's identity plays a lot of a strong role when it comes to why people become more religiously extreme and things like that. But I think it also plays a role with why people leave as well. So growing up, I think I got looped into a lot of the language around extremism. So as an example, if you're an ex-Muslim or a Muslim watching this, Harun Yahya might be a name that rings a bell. He was a writer, Turkish, who would write about how Islam and science prove each other, right? So he'd write these books, and his name is actually Adnan Okhtar, but his written name was Harun Yahya. And we used to read these books. They actually read his books like storybooks, like, in the Quran it talks about the embryo, and that matches what we know in science about the embryo. And they would have like names of white scientists to prove that Islam is true. This stuff often borrowed a lot from Christian nationalism in the US. So William Lane Craig, if any of you know the name, did a lot of that stuff.
Yes.
And it was stolen. A lot of that was taken and borrowed and repackaged with an Islamic view. But then they also had their own stuff as well. And where a lot of their own stuff came from was Saudi funding. So I don't want to go too much into it here, but a lot of the work around Adnan Okhtar came around a guy called Sheikh Zindani. People don't really talk about this. Sheikh Zindani was funded by the Saudi government to go and find Western academics, not from MIT, but like think about that level of university, to go to Saudi Arabia and to do a conference about the relationship between science and Islam. But a lot of the academics were kind of tricked into it, so they would ask them a question like, if the Quran said X, would that be miraculous? And they would say, I wouldn't know how they would know that back in the, it would be like that. But they would cut it and chop it up into a documentary that made kids like me think, whoa, Islam and science, yeah. So for a long time, for like 30 years, this was the narrative. For 20, 30 years, I would say this is the narrative. And there was no pushback because a lot of the atheists who were sort of English-speaking really went against the Christians like William Lane Craig. They had no way to talk to the people like me from this kind of background. So the concept of da'wah, which is preaching, moved heavily into the sciences, I think. And if you were like me, very science-driven, or if that was an interesting thing for you, it actually enforced Islam and extremism, then take it away. Because what happened is you went, well, science is amazing, and look at all it's done for us, and it is a way to understand truth. And Islam directly and congruently attaches to it. Therefore, if the book is saying, insert extreme thing, you're going to believe it, right? So that's kind of how a lot of the younger generation went into extremism, in my generation, I would say. Of course, that didn't last very long. I was like that until my mid-20s. And I always say the way I left Islam was not through kind of someday snapped and I was no longer Muslim. It was more like the questions were always there, but the answers over time just did not make sense to me anymore. So an example of that is growing up, I had an Islamic book, Riyadh al-Salihin, and it had certain things in it about like Aisha, the Prophet, the wife of the Prophet. And I was always like, as a kid, I was like, oh, that's a bit odd. That's an odd situation in terms of marital age and things like that. Or, for example, those things about science that didn't check out, like evolution not being real. Well, evolution is quite difficult to say no to the more you learn about it. So things like that, the answers that I got from religious people just stopped making sense. Like, oh, well, there's macroevolution and microevolution. Well, it doesn't make sense. Evolution is a spectrum process. Like they're the same thing, really. It's just time that's your differentiator. Things like that. But you couldn't leave Islam. No one had done it. So in my mind, there's 1.6 billion Muslims and no one's ever left Islam. How arrogant of me to think that I can't believe this, but my family, who are in many, many ways great, they haven't left it. They really believe in it. Or all these other 1.6 billion people. Who am I to say this is not true when the 1.6 billion people believe it's the fastest growing religion in the world, all that kind of stuff, right? So that was a really difficult thing to feel completely alone. Like it's a feeling I don't think many people feel. I think when I've spoken to people who are like trans or gay or something, and they come from like the south of the US, they can talk like that sometimes. That's how it felt. I was like, holy shit, I'm the only one. And that was a very dark time in terms of just like thinking I'm crazy, like genuinely just being like, I must be crazy because how is this possible? But I can't believe it. Like it just doesn't check in. Like everything I'm learning about it doesn't check. Eventually I went on Reddit. This is where I lived and breathed for a long time. And there was a subreddit there. It had at the time only a couple of hundred people called ExMuslim. And even the word ex-Muslim was a negative thing for me. Like, why would you say ex? All that kind of stuff. But there was a lot of people on there that had been through similar journeys to me. And I think over time, I started realizing, wait, there's other people. The problem is they were all online. So these are all random, anonymous people who were online with my nickname was Improvaganza because I was doing improv drama at the time to learn about things that are not science-based. And they're all anonymous people. And I don't know, I was always like, humans are interested. Like, I just always like meeting people and stuff. So I remember the first person I ever met was a kid from the north. I don't know who he is anymore. Like, I forgot who he is. I don't have his details. I have no idea who this kid is. And I was going to meet him in a train in King's Cross. And I remember messaging my friend Jessica, who was a non-Muslim from university who I trusted. I said, Jessica, can you go to King's Cross and sit and tell me if he looks legit? Because I was going to sit up far away and be like, do you see him? Blah, blah. And she was like, yeah, he's there. He looks like he doesn't look like he's going to kill you. Right? So, so I met this kid, and he was bisexual and ex-Muslim, and it was just really interesting. Like, it was like, I don't know, it felt like coming out. Like, it really felt like we just word vomited on each other for about 3 hours. And it was like, for me, it was like drugs after that. I just kept meeting ex-Muslims back to back to back to back. And then me and a couple of people started building a vetting process, safety-wise, how do you build communities and groups. Some of the people online alongside me set up groups like ExMuslim. So Muhammad was one of the first people I spoke to online. His Reddit nickname was, I think, Mudgo or something. It's still got a Reddit account. So we were just online kids, really, and it all became offline eventually. And that was the foundation, I would say, of some of the grassroots communities that developed. No one single-handedly did anything. It was all spontaneous, and it was quite natural and organic. Now, there were activists at the time who were public, so there were certain names that were public, but they didn't feel like a normal kid on the street. They felt more like an activist, so they were well known within certain circles, but in my family, we'd never heard of them. The mosque didn't talk about them. Like, it was quite limited to what was the problem is growing up is that you didn't hear about the concept of leaving Islam. You heard about Christians who became atheists. You heard about this and that. No one ever leaves from Islam. So that was the biggest thing, right? Like, for us, it was like, how do you change that? So we set up I started meeting also online. There was ex-Mormons and ex-Hasidic Jewish people as well on Reddit. I remember like reading stories and being like, it's so interesting, like it's so similar. And it was 2 a.m. near King's Cross where my house was at the time. And my friend who's an ex-Hasidic Jewish person was there. And we were just talking about how it was hilarious that our families were almost the same. Even though he was ex-Hasidic Jewish, and I'm from a Muslim background, we had more in common than some other ex-Muslims did with me because I'm from such a religious conservative family. And that's where the concept of faith to failure started. It was the idea of cross-apostasy work, like not just ex-Muslim, but wider than that. I don't want to go too much into that work and all that kind of stuff, but needless to say, the focus was outreach first, like can we put our faces on YouTube? A lot of that work was trying to put normal people on YouTube, like not an activist, but like someone who's a mother, someone who's got 20 children, someone who's like left Islam, but their wife is Muslim, and how do you deal with that? Normal people. And that I think was quite successful. Like we really, I think, touched a lot of people online who were like me, who really felt alone. And slowly these videos did really well. Like some of them had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views, and we got into documentaries and things like that. And then the next step became more regulatory work. So it's like, how do you work with services to help them understand that apostasy is a thing, leaving religion is a thing. And I remember when I was growing up, like, of course, you go to mosque, every Friday at the very least. You shouldn't be going every day. You should be going 5 times a day. But no one ever does, of course. It's a lot. But especially on Friday, they have that sermon. It's called khutbah, and they give a sermon. And the sermons are often a way of keeping the communities together, a way of enforcing religious orthodoxy as well. And they never talked about ex-Muslims in sermons, like I remember growing up. That's why I never knew about it. And I remember the day that I thought we had made it was coming up to Eid, which is a religious festival at the end of Ramadan. Ramadan is a very intense time for ex-Muslims because you're in the closet often, but you're having to fast, not drinking water for 13, 14 hours a day. And importantly, there's a lot of religion thrown at you when you don't believe. It's quite a lot for people. And I remember hearing that khutbahs in my area that I grew up, the mosques were talking about these people. They called themselves ex-Muslims. And they were telling the people in the mosques, including the children, stay away from ex-Muslims. And I thought, oh, we've made it, because you're talking about us now. You were trying so hard not to talk about us, and now you have to talk about us. And by doing that, you've lit the fire that we could not light. So there started to be a lot more of that. It just accelerated really quickly. So some of these like nutty YouTube dawah, like preacher people who were like really crazy. They're the people like go up to you on the street and are like, what do you think about Jesus? What do you think about gay people? We have those as well. And they started taking our videos and cutting them up and like doing like responses to them, like YouTube funny responses or whatever. The problem was those videos got often 5 to 10x the views we did, which was fantastic because their audience were usually young Muslims, all of which would consider either leaving Islam at one point or will have family or friends that will leave. So I loved this stuff. I loved that they were taking our videos, chopping it up, and yeah, they made us look bad. Like they were like, oh look, she left because she wanted to party, because she said, oh, I wanted to be like my other friends. Yeah, of course she did. We all want to do certain things to live in life. If you don't believe in it, you want to do things that people do in life. So they chop things like that up and say, you leave not because of theology, you left because you want to take your hijab off and party. Stuff like that. Of course, it's not true. So any Muslim that has any kind of due diligence on this would be like, wait a minute, like there's ex-Muslims I meet who really know what they're talking about Islamic theology. And so it kind of forced people to know we exist. And this was the big shift that happened. It got to the point where, people were coming out online, like random people in places like Sri Lanka, which was quite dangerous for that person I'm thinking about specifically. Couple of people from, like there's a guy called Sheikh Jabir in Egypt who was doing videos, specific videos against Islam. He's been doing it for a while, before us even. But you just start to get this fabric, which meant that, it's a thin fabric, but it meant that if you were Muslim growing up, you would come across us at some point. And that was a big shift that's happened over the last 10 years, I would say. And since then, I think it's been, there was an Islamic conference that my mate ran. It's a progressive, they're not quite Muslimish, but they're a bit progressive. So I was probably the first ex-Muslim to ever speak at an Islamic conference, which was very, very interesting. And the audience, I don't think they quite knew what to do with me, because if you talk to me as a Muslim, I grew up in a very Muslim background because of like the language and what I grew up with and my style of upbringing. But at the same time, I really love theology. I find theology so interesting. Like the history of religion is really interesting. And a lot of Muslims don't. They don't actually study Islamic theology. They find it kind of boring. They study it kind of rote because they have to. But a lot of Muslims don't grow up with that kind of love for how theology works and for history. So it was quite interesting. Like a lot of Muslims came up to me afterwards and were kind of talking to me about their doubts. And I don't ever want someone to leave because they're having. I want people to be on their own journey. But often I found that Muslims don't have anywhere to go about doubts, and that's like a pressure cooker. And that is, I think, going to be the biggest advantage if you want to fight, particularly extremism. Because extremism happens in a vacuum always. So if you look at far-right extremism, it's the same thing. If you look at white nationalist extremism, often there are people who are, at least in the UK, come from struggling backgrounds who, if they're male, for example, they maybe don't have outlets for emotional feelings and things like that. They find friends online and they become wounded that way. It's the same with a lot of Muslim people become extreme. You don't have outlets for your feelings and someone's offering you a solution which links in with your existing identity. And there's a vacuum of conversation. And this is why these kind of things are so important, particularly things like Muslimish, because it creates a sense of, there are other people that are different to you. And so that's kind of largely my 2 cents on what's happened up till now. I want to keep this very open, so if you guys have questions, please ask me questions. I know some of you have a bunch of things that you're going to. Why don't you go first?
Okay, well.
And maybe while someone's kind of getting himself ready, one interesting thing for me in terms of building communities and things like that is it's no different from building startup technology companies, because that's what I do professionally. And what are you doing? So you've got limited resources, you have specific actions you want to take. You want to scale is really important, how you scale something. So a lot of the things that I've done with startups is very similar to what I did with apostasy movements and communities as well. And it's something that I try to promote when I talk to groups or communities is learn from what startups have done. Now sometimes it can be really wanky and the language can be very wanky, but there's a lot of learning in how you scale and grow things that you can bring into any kind of activism or community building that you want to do. But that's just like a little thing. No one's done any research on this, but there's a lot of people who've built successful nonprofits that I know about that come from professional backgrounds, so it's quite interesting. No one's done any research on it, I think. Sure.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that very interesting, this concise summary of an opening statement, and I want to bring it maybe to some current events and things like that. So just in the last week, Iran executed 2 people for blasphemy.
Yeah.
And there was a man who was lynched over alleged blasphemous remarks in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And that there was some unfortunate videos that was live streamed, I think. And that was maybe not to laugh about it, but it was unbelievable kind of just seeing that brutality over it. Of course, we've also seen this with Mashal Khan and Farakunda and so on in the years past. So what is this kind of effect that this might have on the even questioning the orthodoxy?
Yeah.
When something even saying something like I love this politician more than the prophet or something like that, to get you brutally beaten for 7 minutes at least.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to be careful when I talk about countries beyond the UK or Saudi Arabia, where I grew up, just because I want to be careful. I'm not a subject matter expert in what's happening politically in the countries. But, the issue you have is when you have hegemony of thought, when you have a heterodoxy of thought, you don't have any movement. Now, Bangladesh is an area I can talk a little bit about. So, Bangladesh always had a rich history of debates and discussions around some of these topics. It's in many ways, it has a very, very strong secular backbone to the country, and strong identities that go beyond Islam. There was always a strong Hindu community in Bangladesh, although that's been changed over time, but there was always that. And so Bangladesh, you saw a lot of kind of the fight, right? People who were secular, people who were extreme religious, and people who were sort of moderately religious and liberal religious. And there was always a debate and discussion. And then people started getting murdered. You got bloggers starting to get murdered that had what's called a chilling effect in sociological terms, which mean that your day-to-day interaction is more heterogeneous. It's way more like Islam is the one and only thing, right? So, and specific kind of Islam, it's kind of blasphemy is a really important type of thing.
Yeah.
And the internet is a double-edged sword for that, because historically, the internet, you saw a boom of countervailing thinking that was opposite to extremism for a while with Islam, but you also got a very, very well-funded campaign to push extremism. Very well-funded. And they had more money than anyone who's anti that. So you saw this proliferation of extremist theology. Yeah. Some of it was extreme in the sense of chop people up, ISIS, and some of it was extreme in the sense of orthodoxy is the only form of Islam. So there's 2 types of extremisms, but they kind of create the sense that that's the only thing, that's the only game in town. I will say, and this is maybe the slight optimist in me, I think that's changing again. And the reason is, this is going to sound really weird, but hijabi women on TikTok, women often face the brunt of orthodoxy, and young women are relating to Islam they have almost their own subculture now. So they will hijab, they'll promote hijab ideology, but then they'll say, "Oh yeah, my bike friend." They'll talk about LGBT. You know, like it's really
yeah.
interesting that that's happening, particularly on TikTok. So I think the parents and the older generation have lost control of the younger Muslimah generation, and I think that's you can't undo that. That's going to be very difficult. And I'll give you an example of this. In the UK, we have a lot of young women who wear niqab, like they wear full face covering, and anecdotally, I will say a lot of it is choice based. I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, but these are young women who their family don't like niqab. Even like their father, they're often Bangladeshi or Pakistani, they don't like it, but there was a push of extremism, and part of this was niqab, and it got taken up. But I have spoken to a number of women who wear the niqab in London who have you'd be surprised, views on LGBT, for example. So I think there's a shift happening where people are more okay with having thoughts that are more, they're more heterogeneous rather than homogeneous, and that will be good. Now, another problem we have, and one of the audience members had this conversation with me earlier, is the West, which should be a safe haven for thought, often is not for ex-Muslims. Or even if you're not an ex-Muslim, you're progressive or you're LGBT Muslim, whatever. It isn't. What I mean by that is, yes, you're alive. Maybe there's honor violence risk, but you're alive. But in spaces like university campuses or in the public sphere, there's another chilling effect where people are like, you're saying that there's problems in Muslim communities, you must be racist, or you must be this, or you must be that, and they shut us down.
Native informant.
It's a native informant concept, yeah, like Uncle Tom, all that kind of stuff. So, I think that's changing as well. I have had enough anecdotal experience with people who would have said that in the past who don't say that anymore. I think there's enough movements against that now.
Yeah.
But it's still a problem, right? And it's really frustrating, as you can imagine, because, like, first of all, you're erasing my ethnicity when you say that. Secondly, you're assuming all Muslim people, who tend to often be ethnic, are only able to have orthodoxy as their culture. They're not allowed to do anything else, which is also a really kind of a racist view if you're not from that background. I don't like to throw the word racism out like this, but if you use your logic, you are doing that as well. And people often talk about power dynamics, and we had a really good conversation earlier about power dynamics and things like that, and that's often used to stop people like us talking. Power is complicated, it's not binary. There are power dynamics within our own community. The religious leadership are the power in our community, right? They're often well-funded, they have power, they get to kill people. Like you're saying, blasphemy is a powerful concept in some of these countries. So when you don't shout against blasphemy, you are feeding the majority rule in the country. How is that seen as good activism? It's not.
Okay.
So,
actually, I want to bring up heterodoxy and Muslims and such in terms of the reaction from the Muslims, the male Muslims who occasionally I see like manosphere type movement of sorts.
Like Andrew Tate converted to Islam.
Pikachu and so on. There's this sort of almost a merging of these sort of very conservative and like they're kind of reaching back a bit like the manosphere in the Christian world, kind of reaching back for this trad values and so on, and they're kind of almost forming an alliance. And Andrew Tate is a great example as well of like that what Shadi Hamid calls the political conversion, or where religion is viewed as sort of this bulwark against progressive values, and it's kind of being driven by that.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because growing up, like a lot of people from Muslim backgrounds in the West tended to be more left-leaning, like they would vote as a bloc to pro-left, whatever that left party was. Like in the UK, Labour or Lib Dem, or mostly Labour. In the US, it might have been Democrat. And yet, the same Orthodox Muslim populations were actually quite far right in some of their views, more right-wing, from right-wing to far-right in their views. And I like that this is happening because I think it's more true to what their underlying political beliefs are, and it's showing integration with wider society in the West because it means that you're not afraid to be in with the people who are actually were historically racist or whatever. So I'll give you an example of this. I was in a talk by, I've totally forgotten the guy's name, I was mentioning this to you earlier. As a professor at Oxford, he's in trouble now, I think he's in hospital. He is like a Muslim Brotherhood, his grandfather was a founder, I forgot his name. Anyways, someone here will know. And he was doing a talk about decolonizing education using Islam. This is at SOAS, so if anyone knows SOAS, that makes sense, right? So I remember going there being like, what is this? And I was so angry, because I was like, I'm from a Southeast Asian background. We're taught Arabic, Fusha, like classical Arabic, correct? That's what we have to learn. You have to learn the Quran. You believe that Arabic is the language of paradise. Muhammad is an Arab. The Sahaba who were around Muhammad were the most important people. You should like they're the best, right? They're all Arabs, largely. Some of them were Persians, but largely they were Arabs. And we're supposed to believe they're the best people. And how is that not colonized? Like, if you're like going to talk about colonization, how is that not exactly the same thing? And I remember mentioning that and kind of got brushed away. And one of the organizers was a guy that I remember he was quite a leftist guy, he's very anti-fascist, used to fight Nazis on the street kind of dude, he's from a Jewish background. And did some really great work, or he did some fantastic work growing up. And I said to him, why are you here supporting this guy? He's essentially a far-right extremist. He believes gay people should be pushed off buildings in a caliphate, all that kind of stuff. And the guy started talking about power structures to me, that this man who was saying Islam is decolonizing is trying to protect the rights of Muslims who are oppressed in the UK and that kind of stuff. And I was like, yeah, but he is oppressing the same Muslims that you're saying is protecting, because he's pushing a certain type of orthodoxy. Didn't work in his head. And it was so frustrating for me, because I tend to be a little bit more like left-leaning, and not super left, but like reasonably left-leaning. And it's so frustrating to see people on the left supporting essentially far-right people. And I think it speaks a lot to the hypocrisy that you have, where some of this politics is not really helped by, it's identitarian, it's not really helped by underlying liberal thought. Right? So that's kind of what I would think about that side.
Yeah, I find that when you talk about like these communities that are kind of splitting along ideological lines, are not just defined by religion. That seems like integration to some extent, right? And I guess that's a small blessing, right? Yeah. And yet there's also not really like a full. I was thinking of SatanCon this past like a couple of weekends ago in Boston, where there were all these Christian firebrand preachers and such, but there was no Islamic preachers there at all. It's interesting, because like the shaitan is a concept in Islam as well. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe they got the point of the Satanic temple, or maybe they also thought, like, given like there were a lot of tiffs between Catholics and Protestants there, so maybe they thought, like, if they entered the fray, they'd just be. I would say it's probably more because they don't relate to the Satanists. They think the Satanists are ex-Christians. That's your problem. If you were a Muslim who left and is a Satanist, that would absolutely get protests. Does that make sense? So if you had an ex-Muslim stall at the Satanic con, right, I would have expected that. Does that make sense? And this has been one of the biggest problems with representation with ex-Muslims, because up till now, a lot of atheist voices you hear and see tend to be like from a Christian background or whatever it is. You didn't see so many people like us out there, which has changed, obviously, and like people like Sarah Haider and things like that are really important to that. But it's a kind of a recent phenomenon, I would say. So. Just one thing you were mentioning about the things like the manosphere and things like that. Just trad values.
Yeah, and trad values in general. The thing is, in liberal educated societies, you tend to go away from traditional values as much as you can, because like people want their own human rights. And if you want your human rights, like I'll give you an example. This push against abortion in the US has pushed so many people that I know that traditionally would be religious against religion, Christians included. And I'm talking like moderate liberal Christians have just gone, F this stuff, right? So I think we're going to see a couple of things like that happening within the wider Muslim narrative as well. Probably to do with things like the hijab, probably to do with things like apostate killings and that kind of stuff. And this is kind of why I see Muslims and ex-Muslims if they're progressive, do sit on the same line, because what we're doing is ex-Muslims are doing, well, you can do that, you can leave, that's disgusting. And then if you're a progressive Muslim or you're LGBT Muslim, you're like, hey, I can be gay and Muslim. Obviously, a lot of Orthodox Muslims are not going to like that. But then they're like, yeah, but at least you can leave Islam, So you're all pulling the homogeneity of thought this way. That's why I'm not, and like that's why I've always been pro reform and progressive and things like that, because they're all doing the same thing, creating space for thought.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, yeah. And I want to take this conversation towards maybe the like different sub-communities within the ex-Muslim community, or like who actually counts as an ex-Muslim, in the sense of there are some people who, for example, converted to Islam from a non-Islamic background and then leave Islam. So, and I met a few of these through Muslimish, and I'm just wondering like what your perspective is on their participation in the ex-Muslim community. Do they like having, first of all, overcoming convert zeal is quite an achievement. At the same time, there's also the not having a background to kind of a family who's kind of holding you and trying to influence you to stay.
And just so you guys know, like often within the Muslim community, converts are called reverts, because the concept in Islam is everyone's born a Muslim and then you leave. So when you're converting to Islam, you're actually going back to your inner truth or whatever it is. It's a whole thing. I have a lot of space in my heart for converts in particular, because they understand often the switch into Islam, which can be painful for some of them if their family are religious, or if their family just don't like Muslim or Islamic culture or whatever. And then they also face it coming out, because if you're a convert, you've got a lot of pressure when you turn Muslim to be a certain way, to dress a certain way, to marry a certain way, to have children a certain way, and they get stuck. And that's why a lot of the converts I know are actually in the closet, sometimes more than born ex-Muslims. They stay in the closet longer because they've got children. They know they'll lose everything. And people will say, you were a bad person to begin with because you were from the outside. So like, there's a lot of, I think, sad to say, anecdotally, there's been a lot of problems with converts within the ex-Muslim space too, because they're not accepted. Ex-Muslims often get angry, because we're all angry when we leave Islam. We're like angry at everything, right? And then we're angry at converts. Like, you were so stupid to turn Muslim. Unlike me, you had a choice and you chose something so stupid. How could you, And they whitewash that experience, and it's like so bad because they're often not getting that the converts go through sometimes worse stuff than we do. Right? Like really, because think about it. If you converted, especially when you're young, what vulnerability did you have that you got converted? Or if you became extreme, like I've known a guy who went to Somalia to train under, I won't say the word because I'm in the US, a group, very extreme, who went there to train, and he left that. So imagine going to Somalia to train with, and then leaving, how you have no community anymore, because your family are like, you've gone crazy, and your ex-community will literally hunt you down, and he had no one, for example. Actually, in his case, and this is another risk with converts, because he was vulnerable when he was young, he became a far-right extremist instead. So he went from being like proper dodgy, like extremist Islamic, to literally like a neo-Nazi. Like, I don't know what he's doing now, but that shows you the kind of vulnerability he had. There's actually a video I did recently with a convert. She converted when she was like 16 or something, and she married, and lucky for her, him and her left Islam at the same time. She got him out of Islam actually, and she's doing really well. But we did a video together because I was so frustrated by how ex-Muslims treat converts in our example. But it is an interesting sociological phenomenon, like someone entering Islam and then leaving it, because they get to see both sides, what it feels like. And think about it like this: if you're a convert into Islam, you are celebrated. You can literally get millions of views if you do a YouTube channel. You can and then you stop. Then what? I remember there was a girl. She was a makeup artist, a hijab makeup artist. She had converted into Islam, but then she had left, and for 1 year she was still wearing the hijab on her videos because she knew she would lose her career as soon as it happened. And that's what happened to her. She lost her entire career. Just like that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of pressure to be a convert to stay. And I think it's not really thought about by ex-Muslims. So.
Yeah. And in conversion as well, like looking at the sort of attrition that happens in development of ex-Muslim communities, like with it being used maybe like a waypoint or something. Well, like when you convert, there's here's you go to you pray 5 times a day or 1 time a week, whatever. Like there's some there's a place for you to go. There's things for you to do, community for you to interact with on a regular basis and everything like that. But when you leave a religion, oftentimes it's like, well,
what do you do now?
Yeah, you might have meetups with your local group or whatever, if there's one in your area, first of all, or maybe online, and now and then, but then it's not like ritualized.
No, ritual is such an important point. And I feel like often atheist and humanist groups are so scared of the word ritual. But ritual is a secular concept. Every community and culture has the concept of rituals. One thing I think we did quite well, and it was some of the XMNA groups and some of the Australia groups and us, is that we didn't meet up in a pub and chat, or we didn't do a university talk only. We did, on Eid, you'd have people bringing a potluck food together, you'd go partying. It was like different types of rituals, and that way people felt like they could slowly take and not take bits of their life that were previously filled by the Muslim community. Yeah. Because you could leave and then you can go to university and you can party, but no one understands you, right? So like with us, for example, we'd have parties, for Halloween we had one called Mulloween, and it would be Islamic horror was the theme. So, people came in dressed as Burak, the flying donkey thing, or whatever, and it was a shared culture. Now, it doesn't mean everyone talked about Islam all the time, but that shared ritualistic understanding is so healing for a lot of people, but it's also re-traumatizing. So what you said about the concept of a waypoint, I love when people disappear. They're not in the groups anymore, because that means you've taken what you want and you've gone off. And often they come back and go and come back. It's like that means that it's working. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does make sense. Although. How do you maintain some kind of connection, like with them being able to say support the movement in other ways, and that sort of thing, like keeping them, volunteer opportunities or mentorship of people coming out and that sort of thing. Are there like experiences that you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of how you maintain a movement when it's by definition a waypoint for people. There's 2 ways. Professionalize. So in both XMNA and Faith to Faithless, we professionalize. So we got, charity status, put funding into it, like structure it with programs. And often the professionals were not ex-Muslims or even apostates. And that's a good thing. You want outside professionalism to come in. But also that allows you to take in apostates and train them up, or if they have skills, bring them in to run programs. So that's one thing. In terms of volunteer opportunities, yes, there's a lot of that. But around the ritualistic community aspect, because a lot of people will not want anything to do with ex-Muslim stuff anymore because they've moved on, but they love hosting a party, that kind of thing. So that happens a lot. Like when I'm in Toronto, literally every time I'm there, because I'm there almost every other month, I'll go hang out with some of my ex-Muslim friends there, and they'll always throw a little party. It's like a mini party. It's like almost family. But you always bring people over and things like that. So that is volunteering, even if it doesn't seem like it.
It's like you made friends.
You make friends, yeah. It's a network. Yeah, exactly. It's quite interesting. I'll talk about Jehovah's Witnesses a bit, because in the UK, with what I do, it's a lot of like ex-Muslims, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-Pacific Jewish people. And they never have issues with volunteering. Why? Because they're all preachers. They're trained to preach. They're trained to do their form of preaching. So they're so good at volunteering and structuring. I think with ex-Muslims, we're pretty good at that as well, because we do community activities. If you're a Muslim, you'll host an Eid party. You'll get family friends in. So we're all kind of like that as well. So I've never seen an issue with that. Where the issues has been is that a lot of us leaving religion may not be in a good place, and so we don't have the professional skills to run things, and it can lead to a lot of like unprofessionalism stuff, and so that's been a problem, like how to get professionalism in. But I think in the case of XMA, for example, they just built, got 501c, they've got a couple of professionals running the thing. It's quite professional. That keeps it separate from the volunteer craziness.
Like personal interests and politics.
It's a thing. Non-profits. I only realized this recently that a lot of non-profits have a love-hate relationship with their volunteer base because volunteers are so difficult to run that your management overhead is often more expensive than if you just did it. You just paid staff to do it. So it's an interesting area to think about.
I wanted to also ask you about a couple of. Like we're talking about, like someone actually mentioned ex-Muslims in a sermon, and I noted a couple of them. Like there was an ex-Muslim, like these Islamic counter-atheism conferences. There was in 2021. There was the challenge of atheism among Muslim youth by the Conference of Muslim Jurists in Houston. Just in March this year, there was Islam, Science, and Atheism in Lahore, another conference, and I think there was one in the UK. And the exact time.
I went to that.
Yeah, but. Yeah, they are taking notice now.
Yep, and they're doing big conferences, and like I'll tell you, I can talk only about the UK one because I was there. I wasn't in the other ones. They filled the crowd. The parents were shit scared of their children leaving Islam. They packed the room. But at least I can talk about this in the UK. It was a bait and switch because they got everyone riled up about people leaving Islam, and then said, "What you need to do is donate money to us, and vote." That kind of stuff. But that's a double-edged sword because they've just told all the parents who came with their children to try to protect their children from ex-Muslims. They came with the children. Mm-hmm. Now the children know about ex-Muslims. I remember in the audience there was 3,000 people. I was like, oh, there's like so many kids in this. They now all know about the concept of us. They all know we exist. And I bet you a bunch of those kids are actually secretly ex-Muslim. Or they will be. And they will then YouTube the word ex-Muslim because they kept using that word through the whole conference. So again, I think it's a fantastic thing. Because the problem is they can we're not out in the closet. Most ex-Muslims are secret. Right? Muslims are not. Orthodoxy is, you talk about it openly, it's seen as a good thing. Right? They outfund us. They have more reach than us. So if they use their own reach to talk about us, which is the only thing we need, we don't need any more than that. We just need the word to be out there and the concept of leaving. We will, by definition, be winning because we'll start cannibalizing themselves. Mm-hmm. They're cannibalizing themselves by doing that, basically. Yeah, it's maybe a controversial opinion, but I think I can justify it because our problem has always been no one knows we exist. Like Islam, like you've got 1.6 billion Muslims, but a lot of them don't even know you can leave it. If you just solve that problem, you will really create a lot of ex-Muslims more publicly.
On a related note of that, and actually going back to what I was talking earlier about political conversions, there seems to also be this issue of political identification with Islam for political purposes. I think after Trump, like the emergence of Trumpism, and I remember Fareed Zakaria of CNN was talking about how, I wasn't really super into this whole Islam thing before, but now, I feel like I should just, put myself out there as having Muslim identity, regardless of how much I actually follow it. And I've seen the sentiment from others as well. Yeah. So I just want to know, will you comment on that in terms of, does this somehow bolster the appearance of, kind of Muslims sticking together or holding the line?
No, I think it doesn't, because often, what do anti-Muslim people do? They say, look, you guys believe ex-Muslims should be killed, gays should be killed, you believe that people who are not Muslim are kuffar and they're bad and we should convert them. They say that.
Yeah.
And they say you all believe that. It's like, there's homogeneity. They talk about homogeneity in that way. Now, of course, that's a dog whistle. They don't actually even care about that, let's say. But that's the language they use. And there is some element of truth to the fact that that's what often Muslims are perceived as. It's not true. We know Muslims have a wide range of thoughts, including people like me and you who don't believe. But you can only deal with... So, for example, I will actively go out of my way to, if someone says something like that, I'll be like, that's just wrong, and whatever. So like I've had conversations with far-right people on Twitter, and like certain well-known, I would say they're anti-Muslim rather than anti-Islam people, and I'm as against them as Muslims who are anti-ex-Muslim. Like it's the same kind of thinking. It's this kind of extremist view of the world. Muslims are complicated. They're just people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Islam was made by people, so Islam is also complicated, right? So I have to be careful though with that, because I also don't want to defend theology, bad theology. I have to be careful with that. But generally speaking, like I'll if they say, for example, oh, Muslims are, like there's a lot of terroristic thinking in the Quran, right? Like, or things like that. I'm like, yeah, the Quran has a lot of things about killing people, sure. So does the Old Testament. And since Islam was made by human beings and the Quran is made by people, it can be interpreted kind of however you want. It's more orthodox in some ways, and especially because of the money in it right now. But and so it's true that's arguably more orthodox, but that doesn't mean that Muslims practice it that way and they view it that way. So I tend to try to create a bit of grey thinking around it, but it's hard because people want yes, of course the Quran says kill the infidel. I mean, yeah, sure. Does that mean that Muslims are going to practice that? I have spent a lot of time with quite extreme Muslims, even as an ex-Muslim. I'll tell you a little story. There was Speaker's Corner. Do you know what Speaker's Corner is in the UK?
I did.
Speaker's Corner. It's like a place, historically, you could go and say whatever you want. So there's a lot of crazy people as well. And Speaker's Corner, there was a guy that was wearing the Saudi thing. He's a convert. He's a Jamaican guy, converted to Islam. And often converts who become extreme are really extreme. And we were talking, and he's like, he was saying that ex-Muslims should be killed within a caliphate, all that kind of stuff. And as I was talking about it, I realized he really loved his kids. He really loved his kids. And I was like, so tell me, what happens if your son, who you love to bits, left Islam? And you could tell he had never thought about it. He was shocked. And he's like, no. And I was like, I come from a religious background exactly like yours, and I am yours. I left Islam. There's a chance he would leave. What would you tell him? And you could tell he had never thought about it in his life. And he didn't say I would want him to die or anything. He said, look, he's my son, I love him. And that's just the truth of a lot of Muslim people. They're just human beings. And when your wife, your husband, your child leaves Islam, it's more complicated than I'm going to shut him out and things like that. And I want people to be forced to deal with that.
Yeah.
Right. But because Muslims are human beings, I don't like this sense of people bucketing them up and saying, you're like this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have problems with our community, but there are other, it's really interesting when you look at the Hasidic Jewish community, actually, because ex-Hasidic Jewish people have a similar question they deal with. Well, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, so am I protecting anti-Semitism when I'm talking about problems in the Hasidic community? Of course not. But the language has to be very precise, otherwise it can aid and abet.
Mm-hmm.
I've been pulled into a lot of by people saying, Muslims are bad, look, he's saying it, I don't know, and it's so stupid, but social media tends to promote stuff like that.
And the thing you were saying about dealing with when the situation arises in your own community or your own near and dear ones, it's like Ali Razi was pointing out, how a Muslim person who ostensibly holds to these traditional values might say death to all, or at least punishment for all, say, LGBT people or something like that, or gay people. But then, when you're talking about someone in your own family who's gay or ex-Muslim, even, they say, oh well, that's okay.
Yeah. Or they just don't want to think about it,
Yeah.
or they try to control them to bring them back. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But death may be not the main thing people are thinking about. I mean, you do have forced violence and things like that, forced marriage and things like that. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's a lot more because they're people, right? Just people. These are real families. These are real people. Yeah.
But that's what ends up in these pupils about, when they ask them these questions, broadly speaking, right? They don't, I've never actually seen a pupil which actually asks, if someone in your family was ex-Muslim, or if someone in your family was gay, or whatever, what do you think should be done about that, that sort of thing, and then, of course, there's the effect of asking a survey question by someone outside.
It's not random,
Yeah. I want to ask about appearances in media. Like there was 2016, there was Decolonizing's exposure to Islam's non-believers. That was in the UK. There was a Dutch feature among non-believers in 2015. But apart from this, there doesn't seem to have been much.
I'll give you.
Apart from your appearances on TV, those are a big debate, for example.
Some of it is to do with money, and some of it is to do with how political lines get formed. So, as an example, if you're a left-leaning publication, historically, ex-Muslims is too complicated to deal with because you're like, well, I'm trying to protect Muslims here from racism or whatever it is. Ex-Muslims messes with that, so they don't touch you. And then if you're kind of more right-leaning, you do go, it's more easier to promote that kind of stuff. But then you'll specifically pick people who maybe will say certain things and not other people, like
Islamic schools should be banned.
Things like that, I mean, not necessarily against banning Islamic schools, but what I mean is if you're a right-leaning publication, you might not want someone who's talking about, there's issues with like how we deal with immigrant populations. Like you might, so you end up split a little bit, and so a lot of right-leaning publications have been more supportive of getting ex-Muslims into things rather than left, which has been very frustrating because traditionally ex-Muslims come from communities that are more left-leaning. It's like kind of an interesting divide. That changed a bit, I think, as ex-Muslims became more normalized as a concept, less activity. So I mean, but money is another big player. So I'll give you an example. There was a documentary on ex-Muslims by Vice that me and a couple of ex-Muslim people were on. But Vice, which is now bankrupt, I think, got funding from the Saudi government. And so suddenly, weirdly, that documentary, which had 5 million views, I think, last I checked, their website, the link was broken for the video. They had it on YouTube still, but it was unlisted for a while, and then they listed it again after we complained. But like, Vice is a very data-first organization. For them to have a broken link for 2 years on the website, it's still broken to this day. It's very, very suspicious. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but isn't it funny that after they got funding from the Saudi government, they pulled that? Right? So, and we see this happening time and time again, that, a lot of like the Qataris also own a lot of media organizations through investment vehicles through Saudi Arabia. It's going to create a bit of a chilling effect there as well. YouTube is another one. So there's a lot of ex-Muslims that do YouTube videos, Instagram. It always gets pulled, or there's a demonetization or whatever it is. I mean, most of us don't monetize. Like I don't monetize anything, but there's like a shadow banning thing, or it gets reported, and then blah blah blah. So there's a lot of like reasons that media companies don't want to promote us. It's getting to the point where the stories are sexy enough that we'll see more of it. Where I think we'll win is when there's a Netflix series or story about it, right? Because that happened with the Hasidic Jews. So there was a documentary on Netflix. What was it called? It was called something. And there was a very well-known TV series of a girl who was from a Hasidic Jew, who's a singer. I can't remember their name, right? Both of them, because they did really well, they exploded the interest in things around ex-Hasidic Jewish people. And as soon as we have something like that about ex-Muslims on Netflix that does well, everyone else is going to try to do it because it means there's interest. And these media organizations just run on interest, right? Mm-hmm. That's what I'm waiting for. That's, I think, like, that's when you've gone into the public media.
And last, I want to ask about like political alliances and misconceptions. Like famously in 2015, December, there was an incident where Mariam Namazi at Goldsmiths University, you were
Vaguely.
Yeah, so in the UK, in Goldsmiths University. Yeah, so she was going to speak about, about Islam from her perspective as an ex-Muslim, and the Islamic organization, the university, kind of painted her as being like a bigot, and then the feminist society and the LGBTQ society kind of, like a World War I alliance chain is just kind of like they all mobilized against her, without actually clearly without actually her having heard what she had to say, because she's clearly not a bigot or anything. So it's just like what we were talking earlier about these political perceptions about like anything to do with saying anything about Islam being a touchy subject, and about like being able to address this in a university setting, for example. It's probably not so much an issue over here, but certainly in some universities, like in Hamline, there's that professor who showed the painting of Muhammad and that sort of thing, and was let go because of that. So I just want to get your perspective on.
I mean,
on that.
there's a huge current and still ongoing topic around teaching. Just to be very clear, teaching the fact that gay people exist in schools in the UK, because in schools that have a stronger Muslim population, you'll get like mobilization and they'll come and protest. Now, what's really important about that is the charities, media organizations that traditionally are pro-LGBT often don't fight as strongly in those situations.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're afraid of the fact that, well, this is an ethnic minority community. Like, it's so stupid, but it's what it is. I mean, what you're talking about in that quote, sorry.
Yeah, there's something similar is happening in the US as well. Like in Dearborn, there were some traditional Muslims who are protesting what they saw as progressive or like in terms of like culturally progressive.
And this is coming into what you were saying earlier about the kind of converging of, because this is kind of what's happening with like evangelical Christianity in this country, which is sort of also, doing this thing in schools and all that. I just want to say what you were saying about Goldsmith. Now, I don't know anything about that specific experience, but I've been through that as well. I've seen it happen to other people as well. It's constant. To give you an example, we were going to run an all-women panel with a female chair about leaving Islam and issues with that through a feminist society that my friend was involved in. And in the end, they didn't run it because they were afraid that they would offend Muslim women in the audience. It was so stupid because the four people on the panel were all from a Muslim background. All of them had worn hijab in the past even. One of them was a feminist activist from another country. Like, it was always so dumb. But and it's very hard to fight that, because if you fight it, you cut any relationship you have with that society. They're just not going to have you. But if you don't fight it, it just keeps happening, And unfortunately, I think a lot of it's still a problem, right? Like, I would want to say that things are changing, and I'm seeing some change for sure. But as you're getting political bifurcation, like in the US, I mean, like, whoa, you guys are really like this. You then end up people just taking that stance because they're so afraid of giving anything, And they think secularism is almost giving. They're almost freedom of speech is giving. It's like so stupid, because freedom of speech is both a right and a left topic. It's not it's not in one camp, right? But it's often seen as, it's theirs or it's ours. It's just so stupid. Identity politics is a real. I mean, I'm not completely against identity politics. I get some of it conceptually, but it's often used to attack anything that doesn't fall within an identity, in a homogeneous identity, which is, because no identity is homogeneous, and that politically is really, really complicated. I just want to say one thing as well. I've used this. A lot of the groups you mentioned in that Goldsmith story are probably lefty, right? And I come from a more lefty background, like traditionally and all that. And one thing that's worked is to just straight up accuse them of racism. Now that does two things. One is the word racism is very scary for people when it comes from a brown person, right? So just pure politics, right? The second thing is I genuinely believe there's some truth to that. Let me explain what I mean. If you think that someone has left Islam and is therefore a traitor to their own group, you are making an assumption that everyone within that group thinks the same. And it's very nice that those people have their little culture and it's orthodox and it's cute. We get to have our individual human rights. You should keep to your own thing. That is a form of racism. Now, that doesn't mean I throw that word around all the time. I don't do that. I don't like doing that.
A soft bigotry of low expectations.
But it is a soft bigotry of low expectations. It's like, I am a traitor to my own. I mean, Muslim is not a race, just to be very, very clear, but it often overlaps with racial politics and minorities, so it often does overlap, and I do believe it does overlap sometimes. But, like, to say because you have left, you are a traitor, is genuinely a form of racism. If you're saying that to someone who's a different race to you and is an oppressed race within a majority in a minority in a majority country, and that has shut people up in the past. And because I don't know if there's an argument to that. Like it's just true. I think if you are often they're not people from an ethnic minority saying it as well. Like they're like in that example of the feminist society said they were all white, right? Now there's nothing wrong with being white, but if you're all white telling a group of largely brown and black women that they might offend a Muslim woman in the audience, there's a problem with that. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, that's been something that kind of language I'm using more and more in politics. Like, do you want, based on your own understanding of racism, you are being racist. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that form of understanding of racism, but if you're going to take your logic, let's take it all the way. Does that make sense?
We have a question on Slido, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I think the question is, I think you already addressed this, but I would like to know what are your thoughts on cultural colonization by the oil-rich Arab countries? I presume that means like Khaliji.
Yeah, Khaliji, yeah, that's really interesting. So, for a period of time, I kind of moved away from ex-Muslim stuff and got really interested in academic study of religious movement, starting with like Satanic, like Persian, all the way to Islam and onwards. And Islam is seen in the West. Islam is seen as a counter force to colonialism in the West, right? And in a lot of Muslim countries, it has played a role in anti-colonial fights with the West. So an example is Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. It's partly the anti-colonial force because in political power, religion is a very powerful tool to kind of group masses. Same with Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, Bangladesh. Like they often work with poor people. They provide services where there's no governmental services, and so they're seen as they're for the people, right? So religion is very good at that. And but
that's why those ads on YouTube,
that's why
donate for this mosque.
Exactly, donate for the mosque and things like that. Now, but Islam spread through empire. It's not complicated. The Arab Islamic Empire was one of the largest, longest held empires ever. This is just a true fact. And one of the ways the empire worked was using the foundation of was using the concept of Islam and Caliphate to as a theological backbone for the empire, just like it happened with Christianity, right? It's no different. Islam is just doing what religions often do with an empire. The problem is, in the West in particular, Islam then got looped in with lefty politics, right? Leftist politics, and then you start to get this weird stuff of whitewashing Islamic colonialism and saying it's a decolonizing force. It's a lefty force almost, right? But like, we grew up learning Arabic, right? Most Arabic speakers in the world are not Arabs. They're Arabic's not their first language. There's like most, right? And we say that about English, by the way, but we're comfortable saying English comes from a colonizing force. We have no problem saying that. We have a problem saying that for Arabic. Muhammad was an Arab. He is the best human that will ever live. Islamically, that's what you have to believe. Arabic is the language of paradise. The best people after Muhammad were called the companions, the Sahaba. They're the best, right? And then there's Tabi'in, which came after that. They're also the best. They're all Arabs, largely. But these are stories you tell non-Arabs.
Yeah.
How is that not colonizing? Like, does that make sense? It doesn't. For me, it's very clearly a colonizing force, whether cultural, in some cases non-cultural. There was a lot of empire building through war and things like that as well. But it's complicated. I don't want to say Islam just spread through the sword. It's more complicated than that. But it is both, which is exactly how Christianity spread, which is exactly how empire spread. Yeah, exactly. So, I don't want to say, just to be very clear, I'm not academic enough to say it's the same as the British Empire. I think they're very, very different, and the way they did things are different, but it's just another colonizing force. It's not complicated. And if that's true, if you have any kind of, if you want to decolonize anything, you need to also decolonize Arab Islamic concepts in education and politics. which people are afraid to do that because it's a hard thing to say.
Including the ongoing ones.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Any questions from the audience?
Thanks for the great discussion today, Imtiaz. I had a question about what you said at the beginning of the talk about how when you grew up in London, how actually like the UK was almost as religious as like Saudi Arabia.
Worse.
Yeah. So like, could you give some background into like I guess why that may be the case? Because it seems a little bit counter. It can seem a little counter.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be clear, this is a personal experience. So, for example, if I grew up in Saudi Arabia within a tribal culture, I might have had way more pressure on me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, but I think one thing is what happened in the UK, from what I understand, and I'm going to try to just coach it with that, is like the government didn't give two shits about extremism. Just to be clear, the government did not care at all about the extremism within Islamic communities. It only started becoming a problem when people started getting murdered, like extreme terrorism, things like that. Then they started going in top down and then into the schools and things like that. So for 10, 20 years, there was a free-for-all where basically tons of money came in from Saudi Arabia and Dubai. I'll give you an example. A lot of Muslims in the UK are actually like what's called Deobandi. So they're from Pakistan. It's a specific type of people. They're traditionally not hardcore Salafi style people like Saudi, Wahhabi, whatever. They are hardcore, but in a different way, right? But they started getting funding from Gulf countries to support their mosques and the books. They would get free books, constant books. And this is how they taught the kids. So there was a shift away from, because Southeast Asian, which is a lot of the Muslims in the UK are Southeast Asian, they're conservative, but they're conservative it's a bit different to what you see now. For example, you might have gone in a village where there was a Hindu in your village, or there was a Hindu opposite. Like if you're Bangladeshi, you would live in a village with Hindus close to you. There'd be a shrine next to a mosque. This was traditional growing up. That's changed, and that acceptance has changed over time, partly because of this money from the Gulf. And the UK government was okay with that. They were okay with like literally hundreds of millions, maybe billions pouring in that way. The second thing is online. The online world happened at the same time. And so during the UK, you grew up with two parents who first generation really don't speak English, and you're a British kid trying to engage. You don't have an identity because you don't feel British. I still don't feel British very well. I mean, I'm starting to, but I still really don't. Right? I'd say I'm a Londoner. And British society doesn't accept you very much, and that is the truth. Like there is some element where some of these kids got pushed away. There's no space for them, right? I mean, it was only in the 1960s that Bangladesh would get like stabbed, beaten, things like that. It happened to my dad, right? Like 70s. So you don't feel British either. And then someone's coming and saying, hey, your name is Muhammad. Do you know what that means? Oh, you know that you have a beautiful book that and then there's political movements happening abroad as well, like Hizb Tahrir in particular, the very famous one, that were sending missionaries to the UK and training people up in the UK and meeting people online, and then creating like groups of people that started doing preaching for political ideology. It wasn't purely Islamic anymore, it was political. So Hizb Tahrir, for example, I'm going to butcher this, but believes that you can work within a democratic system to push it towards the caliphate, right? So like that kind of concept. So some stuff like this started to happen as well. And so young people, you're telling them, I have an identity and it's bigger than this shitty British culture. Of course I'm going to join that, right? And that's why you get people flying off to fight for various extremist groups as well. But the stories that people heard were like, oh, he went to fight for extreme. What you didn't hear is the massive amount of people in our communities that start to get more radicalized. So where before you might have been okay with Hindu people, stop being like that, right? Or before, you knew that you were getting attacked by like a lot of British people, but then you started calling them kuffar and thinking of them as the outsider and the infidel, and they're lower than us, right? That happened. That wasn't what people always believed. It became like a thing. So I think there was a lot of shift because of like online preaching, money. Money is always the big one. And I always say it like this. You're just David, right?
Yes.
So David, if you had $1 billion and you spent $1 billion to try to change the world in a certain way, you probably could. Right? If you have $1 billion, that's what happened. They spent billions with an S to do this. because it made political sense. Like Saudi Arabia realized, and not just Saudi Arabia, Gulf, realized they can have a lot of power. So did Iran with the Shia. If they try to reach into diasporic populations and make them more extreme. Now it wasn't as organized as that, but that was the general thought and consensus, right? And I think that's largely why the UK became such a hotbed for this kind of extremism to this day, You know? And undoing that is going to take a long time. Luckily, the kids are getting sick of it, I would say, because it's not cool anymore. Like your parents are not, the kids are the people who became extremist are the kids now. And they're like, well, I don't want to be homophobic, because a lot of it's to do with LGBT stuff, right? A lot of the societal lines are on LGBT and now ExMuslim little bit by little bit, and the concept of kuffar. But these kids are growing up with other people who are non-religious people or atheists or whatever. Like, how do you hate on someone who's your classmate? It's hard. So I think there's an undoing happening. That was my experience growing up, I would say.
Even that guy Zayn from One Direction,
Zayn from One Direction.
They got
Malik promoted the shit out of that when that happened. Yeah, Zayn from Malik from One Direction was like, I don't believe in Islam kind of thing, and that was like amazing. And you know, if you saw that, you saw a lot of girls kind of going, no, Zayn, and some people going, hey man, it's your journey, and that's kind of what we need. There's a famous makeup artist, her name, I forgot, Dina Tokyo. And she's very famous, like gets stuff with L'Oreal and all that. She's a British, and she took her hijab off over a period of time. She was doing the thing that a lot of Muslim girls will do. It became a turban, and then it did this, and there was a hat, and, you know. And initially was talking about skin conditions, and then she just said, I don't want to wear this. I'm happy for you to wear it. And you can imagine that created so much tension around like what she was doing. But because people like her started to do that, and they're getting a bit of confidence in doing it, it's giving a lot of confidence to many other people. And I remember like ex-Muslims sometimes don't like people like that, like the kind of Muslima makeup, you know, or like, who are kind of, they defend Islam a lot, but they do it in their own way. And I love that stuff, because I'm like, that's how you're creating heterogeneity of thought. But that, me and, for example, Mohammed Sayyid might have very different opinions on that. We sometimes disagree on this. So it's just my perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Imtiaz. My question is, you spoke about the funding from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. These countries seem to be very slowly modernizing.
Yeah.
Do you think that will change things?
Yeah. So to give the context to people, Saudi Arabia, the crown prince essentially did a coup, took over the entire country, and then started releasing liberal laws. Now, when that first started happening, and this is after he killed Khashoggi, like he murdered the journalist, because initially people were excited about that, and then he murdered journalists, and then people were like, oh, wait a minute. And so initially, so I had the BBC and a few media companies approach me about this and say, what do you think is really happening? And I spoke to some ex-Muslims I know Saudi Arabia, and they were like, yeah, this is bullshit, this is a cover, blah, blah, blah. So we were going to do a documentary about this and show that Saudi Arabia has not actually changed very much. And there's a truth to that. Like, for example, they're getting rid of that system that you have to get permission from your father if you leave the country. It's like an app. So if you're a girl, you have to get that, otherwise you cannot leave. And so girls who are leaving, run away from Saudi Arabia, will often like go in Iskolab like enable it on the dad's phone, they'll steal it and then they'll run away. That is supposed to have changed, and it has changed. But what happens is it's not that the government stops you, it's that, it's not that the family have the apps anymore. The government will contact your father because they know that you're trying to leave, and they have a risks assessment system that says you're a young girl leaving by yourself with a one-way ticket, and they'll contact your family, because they've done that to some people I know. Right? So they've gotten smarter on some things. It's not that they've been more free. But I have, for example, I have an ex-Muslim friend. She went back to Saudi Arabia as an ex-Muslim for about a year and a half. Long story. And while she was there, I was like, hey, what's up? How's it going there? Like, blah, blah, blah. And she was at a festival, having a rave with no hijab, partying with her male friend. I was like, whoa. And that's true. You could take an economics view and predict that it's probably because Saudi Arabia has to do this, otherwise they fall the way that all commodity-only countries fall. So he's probably realized that. Whatever the reason is, it is happening.
But aren't atheists still considered terrorists by the government?
Yeah, exactly. So if you're
Or is that 2017 or something?
Yeah, if you're an atheist in Saudi Arabia, you're literally legal definition is terrorist now. But I haven't seen that. That hasn't changed. Like, it was true anyways. Before, they just didn't say it like that. It was codified in law. Saudi Arabia is really interesting because there's freaking so many atheists there. The way I know there's so many atheists is if I talk to people from London who are ex-Muslim, they'll say, and then I found out that one of my friends was ex-Muslim. In Saudi Arabia, it's like, and then I found out that 6 of my friends were ex-Muslim. It's like that. The proportion is so crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is changing. I think what they need more of is Arab speakers who are atheists being online, which is difficult, but they need more of that. There is a couple, like Sharif and a few others, but it's not enough. So yeah. I do think it's going to change though. So.
Well, there are a couple of high-profile escapees from KSA, like one of them.
Yeah, and there, What I think, I can talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia actually because I deal with a lot of people, and Dubai especially, and Emirates, sorry, because I deal with a lot of people running away from there, and even if they don't kill you, which they don't really kill ex-Muslims actually, it's not very common. What they do is if you're a girl, you get put in the social care system, which is horrendous. Like you get put into a psychiatry unit or in the social care system, it's horrendous. If you're a man, your family basically forces you to get married. Right, so it's forced marriage. And often you get sent to like a training thing for being Muslim or something like that. This is what I've often heard. It's rare that the government, and the government can lock you up, but I haven't come across that many of those. It's more that you get kind of, let's de-radicalize, let's put them into the system. They have a very good system for just taking you and swallowing you and you disappear. It's more like that from what I've seen. But that's just the few people I've dealt with, yeah.
So do you want to serve the food?
Sure.
We can just have one question.
I'm around as well. We can chat.
It's one last topic about humor and like being able to bring people out of Islam or like this question heterodoxy. Question orthodoxy. I mean, there's like for example, Vidovids, who's like epic, the parody videos of Zakir Naik and so on. And the Surah for Kaf, and those kind of like parodies as well. And I guess some of them of yours as well, like the Ramadan hacks are kind of like beloved, a humorous vein and such. So I'm just wondering what you think of like these, of being able to raise consciousness of ex-Muslims through humor and
I love that question. Yeah. I so believe in it. Interestingly, a lot of the most famous Muslim comedians are all atheists. So Kumail Nanjiani, what does he play now? Marvel. He's like in Marvel now, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
He's an atheist. He's open about it. He's changed the language around it a bit recently. But there's also who's the other comedian who's Arif? No, he's a short. Aziz Ansari. Yeah. He talks about like he's not really religious. He eats bacon, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
My guess would be he's an atheist as well. He's an ex-Muslim. A lot of comedians in the UK. There's 2 comedians I know personally are ex-Muslim. One of them is one of the most famous comedians in the UK. Not open about it because it's bad for their careers to some extent. If their audience has a lot of Muslims in it, you don't want to be out like that too much. I think it's very common that comedians, but they're not that open about it, And it's because it's dangerous or it's bad for their careers, whatever it is. I love the idea of more humor for this kind of stuff, and I think we're going to see more of it. Now we're seeing it in the progressive Muslim stuff. So if you look at Miss Marvel, there's a lot of stuff in there that relates to a Muslim girl who doesn't believe in maybe the Orthodox way, but also is a Muslim. It's like they're stretching out the complexity of it a bit.
I mean, there's actual gods in that universe.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But the gods are almost paganistic. Yeah. They're like pagan gods, right? They're extremes and all that kind of stuff. I would love to see more ex-Muslims comedians. Though there's a few that I know that have done well and then ended up not talking about it because it's too difficult for their careers. I don't know if that's going to change, but YouTube is a big leveling platform. So if you can because YouTube, you can create an audience, and there is an audience for this, I know that. So I'd love to see more of that. I don't do humor that well, like, it's not my thing. Vidu does that better. But yeah, no, I really believe in it. It's also a way for, just to give a bit of context, a guy called Vidu Vitz is a comedian. So he did a lot of YouTube skits on extremist Muslim preachers and things like that. It got very, very successful. But interestingly, a lot of his fan base was actually Muslim. Because there's not enough, if you're a comedian and you're Muslim and you're keeping within that orthodoxy frame, you can't be that funny. Because you're not actually touching, comedy is always about touching those touch points that everyone feels but doesn't want to say.
Yeah.
Well, Video was doing that. So a lot of his, even people in my family loved it, without realizing they were doing it. And then he was very openly ex-Muslim, and then I think some of the Muslims got like this about it. So I really want more of that. And I don't know how to create. Actually, weirdly, I was talking to a friend of mine about creating a content machine where we basically support young creators, and one of them would be that we support comedian ex-Muslims who want to do more of that work online in doing that work. Because I just think it's so important to foster that. And it, again, humor and art is always a way to fight against cultural homogeneity, right? So, no, absolutely. Yeah.
And do you have any closing thoughts? Something positive?
Yeah, I think I talk a little bit about extremism sometimes, and I talk about I often talk negatively. I've been a bit more optimistic in this talk. So, for example, I don't feel like I've done much, and I'll tell you why. I get so many emails from people in the Middle East in particular, but also Pakistan, Bangladesh. Like, it's just like a torrent of emails or reaches out for help where you can't do jack shit. Like, you're stuck in a village in Pakistan, you're in Al-Bindi or something, or you're in Izmir in Turkey because you went across the border and now you're stuck there, as like Rana was. What am I actually going to do? Like, I can't. And if you go back to the beginning, if there is 60 million ex-Muslims out there, largely living in Muslim countries where there's oppression, it's not a solvable problem. It's going to take way too much time. So it's kind of depressing almost. But I have seen lives really change now. And I think a big part of it is some of these Muslim countries, the living standards are going up. Education standards especially are going up. Iran has more women in STEM than men. If you're in STEM, there's a likely chance you're thinking critically around at least science. And if you think critically about science and you're evidence-led, then you're not going to be as orthodox. So I see that happening globally. I'm seeing also, like, within the online space, which is where a lot of the conversations happen, so much more heterogeneity of thought. Things are changing. I just think we need to throw a little bit more resources on it. And I think people need to, every time someone comes out online as an ex-Muslim, you are by definition reaching tens of thousands. And this is how I try to explain it to ex-Muslims. Ex-Muslims sometimes want to come out, but they're not sure what, and I'm like, if you do decide to do it, you're literally helping thousands by definition, because there's not enough content still. So if you guys have any friends who are ex-Muslim, or you're an ex-Muslim yourself, and you're thinking maybe I want to do it, but I'm not sure or whatever, like, at least know that the impact will be huge, because it has been huge for me coming out, like, in my community and things like that. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.